disputes, emanating from misunderstandings, if you will, because contracts were not understood or contracts were not highlighting really what the issues can actually be in that regard. Can you explain to us, the essential elements that must actually be present for a contract to be legally enforceable?
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Let me just start by saying I am practicing with a law firm called Puso Moreng Legal, and I'm a partner there, specializing mainly in areas of commercial, agreements, property, conveyancing, and family law. So when you talk contracts, that's one of my specialties.
100.
Yes, so you were asking about elements of a contract. To start off, a contract is an agreement. Basically, to simplify it, an agreement between two or more people that creates binding obligations, legal obligations. And when you talk of binding, we're talking of enforceability, to say a contract must be able to be enforced under law. So when you talk of elements of a contract, firstly, right, there must be a valid offer. Yes, and let's think of an agreement of sale. If someone is, selling you something, they need to offer you that item, and then you need to be able to do what? Accept the offer. So that's the second element, acceptance.
Yeah.
So one person must make an offer, then the other one must accept it. Right, and then the third element, and this we'll see mainly in commercial contracts, there has to be the consideration. And I think this is where, disputes always arise, where people, and I know a lot of Batswana call like being where, that's the thing. So the consideration or the value must be very clear and explicit in your contract, so that the person knows how much they should be giving, and the other person must know how much they are receiving. Yes.
Right.
And then the other element, I think this is the fourth one, there must be that intention to contract. Without it, there's no contract. Yes, if a person is not, willing or is not aware that they're entering into a contract, then that contract by law is voidable or void, however you may want to call it.
Right.
Yes.
Now, I'm sure that in your business, you said that, when we talk of issues of contract, that's your speciality.
Yes.
I'm sure you've come across, situations where businesses have had common pitfalls. Are you able to just elaborate them to us to say, what have you experienced in your line of work? What are some of the common pitfalls that businesses find themselves in, and how can they be avoided?
Yes, I think the biggest pitfall right there is the fact that they just don't, outline their contracts. That's the starting point. There are no contracts in place, or if they are, they are unclear or ambiguous, where parties have contracted, but the obligations of each party are not clear as to who has to do what and who must do what. And to take it a bit further, there's also the issue of breach, to say if the other party does not perform, what must happen. And that is why a contract is very important.
Yeah.
Of course, contracts can be oral. Let's make that clear. People sometimes come and say, I enter into an oral contract, is this enforceable? Yes, it is, but remember, an oral contract is difficult to prove as compared to a written contract that has been put down on paper and the parties have signed, and they can be held bound by their signatures. So I think the biggest pitfall is the absence of a contract in the first place, or the absence of a clear contract in the first place that clearly outlines what each party's obligations are in the event of breach, and what is expected of each party. Because really that is why a contract exists in the first place, to outline the rights and obligations of each of the parties, timelines if there are any, if there's issues of notice period. If I'm terminating and I have a contract with you, how much notice must I give you? People often come to the office and say, I'm in this situation, this person came today and said, I must vacate the property, or I must return what I got from them. Then the question is, what was the agreed notice period that you had to be given before this person can, get out of the contract or cancel it?
Yeah,
yes.
Right. So what's advisable here? I saw just recently an entrepreneur was actually looking to draft a contract for their employees, and they went on Google to say, what can I draft quickly? Is it advisable to draft your own contract, or do you need a legal practitioner to actually help you with the draft? Because also that you guys don't come cheap. It's quite pricey for one to engage an attorney in this regard. What's more advisable, and what's also more binding, if you will, legally?
You see, An attorney will always make sure that a contract that you are entering into firstly is legal. Remember, the legality of it matters. To say this must be a legal contract. You can't enter into a contract where, for example, you are trading body parts for sale. That's illegal.
Yeah.
It cannot be a valid contract. So an attorney will make sure that whatever you are entering into firstly is legal. Secondly, when you go on Google, you might be getting, a general, employment contract that you then use, and you find that some clauses in there are not applicable to the Botswana law.
Yeah.
Remember, there's also the issue of the law. Is this contract allowed in your jurisdiction? Where in Botswana, there are certain things that are allowed, there are certain things that are not allowed. So an attorney should be able to then assess and say, no, but for your employment contract, these terms are relevant, these terms are allowed in Botswana, otherwise you'll find yourself breaking the labor laws of the country. So that is why an attorney is important. Now, of course, you'll talk about affordability and all of that. You stand, in my opinion, and this is what I always tell my clients, you stand to lose more. If, for example, a contract is 3,000 pula, you could save that money. Of course, you pay it at the beginning, it's a hit, but at the end of the day, you've saved yourself a lot of legal issues, ambiguous situations where you don't know what has to happen. You are being dragged before courts of law, and now you have to pay much more just because your contract was not proper. Yeah.
So we were talking about breach earlier. How does one then handle a situation where one party actually believes that there has been a breach of contract in that regard?
Okay, so, and again, the importance of written contracts. Written contracts will always be clear, one, on what amounts to breach. That is, an attorney who's good at drafting contracts will ensure that there's a clear definition of what breach is. Right? Once now there's that definition, there's now the issue of what happens in instances of breach. Then a contract will be clear to say, no, if you don't perform your obligations, this is what happens. For some contracts, I'll give an example. We've seen contracts where, there's forfeiture of a deposit that you've paid. You've seen this happen where a person says, no, you failed to pay for the balance. I can't return, the deposit that you had paid, because that is the remedy that I have in terms of our contract, right? So that is one of the other things. Also, the clause on breach will also cover instances of dispute resolution to say, before I escalate to court, do I need to go through internal dispute resolution mechanisms first before you escalate. And we've seen, these as big issues where the contract is clear that before you go to court, you need to have mediation, right? You need to have arbitration. There's other dispute resolution mechanisms that have been provided. And then a person jumps the gun and goes to court immediately when a person is in breach. Then the court will say, no, there were, other avenues that were provided for in your contract, which were clear as to what you need to explore before you escalate this matter to us being court. Go back to the internal dispute resolution mechanisms first before you come to court. So that is the entire thing about breach.
Right. Now, in what ways can businesses actually proactively use contract law to mitigate legal risks as well as to protect their own businesses? Because I know that you find that a lot of these contracts are drafted in a way that they would mostly favor the business versus the service provider, whoever it is that comes on the other side of the contract. Now, how can businesses proactively use the contract law to ensure that they protect themselves as well as their businesses?
As a starting point, I think we shouldn't say, people use contracts to favor themselves. That is not the purpose of a contract. It is not to favor one party. It is to balance the rights of the party and outline their rights and obligations and make sure each of the parties are protected. And this is, what I always tell my clients when they come to the office to say, if they're buying property, for example, I'm here not representing either the seller or the buyer. I'm here representing both parties to make sure that both your rights are protected. And the contract has to be balanced in that regard. So a contract that is unfair or that favors one party, in my opinion, that's not a good contract. Yes, and I'd say, businesses should use contract to ensure that there's a balance. Firstly, there's a clear indication of what each party's rights and obligations are, and to ensure that there's, an indication of what happens in instances of breach. That is how, business owners can use contracts to their advantage. Enter into a contract, enter into a written, clear contract. If, earlier you spoke of a person Googling a contract and then using it. Fine, you can do that maybe to reduce the cost and then take it to your attorney to vet it. That is a bit cheaper because already there's an outline. So the attorney's duty is only to vet, to remove those clauses that maybe are not applicable in terms of our law, to remove those clauses maybe that are prejudicial to one of the parties, and just to create that balance that I've been talking about. Yes.
Right. And I know that right now we're talking about, contracts from a perspective of a business. For
Yes.
those that then get into contract to contract or to work with that business, what are some of the things that they should look out for? You were talking about, a contract not meant to favor one, but also just to make sure that all the rights for both parties are actually looked after. What should the person who's coming in into this business look out for to ensure that they don't get themselves into a contract that is somehow dodgy, if you will? Because sometimes you are desperate for this job, you're desperate to get into business with this entity, but you find that there are certain things that you might have missed when you're looking into the contract. What exactly should one look out for before they get into a contract?
I think the same rule applies to now a person who's getting in, who's not the business owner.
Sure.
The same principles of, equity, fairness, balance, legality still applies to you, in that when you are employed, for example, or you are getting in maybe as an investor, or you are being engaged, as a consultant getting into this business, you look at the contract and make sure that your rights are also protected, and that there's a clear indication of what happens if there's breach. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where we leave it for now. Thank you so much
We're
for that. We're done. It was very, very insightful
Yes.
conversation to have with you this morning. Thank you so much once again for taking time out to talk to us about this very important issue.
Thank you so much, Rati. I appreciate the opportunity.
100%. One conversation there with attorney Percival Moreeng to dissect, how establishing clear and detailed contract terms can actually, help you as an individual, as a business, to mitigate risk in that regard and ensure that you protect your business and yourself. I'm sure that you got a thing or two from their conversation. We come up at the top of the hour with the news. Stay with us. This is the Daybreak. Good morning.
I think it's fair to say that we started off 2024, as we'd said, still actually very cautious, if you recall, and we were right to be cautious. It's not been an easy 6 months. We did have a little bit of an upliftment at the first quarter. In the diamond industry, that's not unusual. We tend to come back after the season in the US, a little uplifted, and that sees the market moving forward normally a little better. But if we're honest, that's been a challenging 6 months post that. It's driven largely, as you will see on the slide, we'll start off with the most difficult area.